Hello, and welcome to Diplomatic Community. My name is Kelly McFarland, Director of Programs and Research at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Climate negotiators and world leaders will gather in Glasgow, Scotland, from October 31st to November 12th for the latest iteration of the high-level UN Climate Change Conference. President Biden will be among the world leaders attending this 26th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or commonly known as COP26. The conference aims to secure international commitments to reach net zero emissions by 2050 and to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius. The conference also seeks to mobilize $100 billion of climate finance each year. But there's a problem. The international community as a whole is failing miserably to meet its climate commitments, many of which were agreed or updated under the 2015 Paris Agreement. For this episode, we wanted to assess the trends in environmental security and climate change since ISD first convened a working group on this issue in 2016, and to look specifically at the impact of climate change on migration around the world. We'll hear from several experts, including Jeremy Mathis and Bibi Gonzalez, who appeared on earlier episodes this season that dealt with climate change, specifically its impact on food insecurity and on the Arctic region. You can listen to those two earlier episodes via the links in the show notes. This year's COP26 summit comes in the wake of a series of alarming reports about the state of our planet. The Washington Post reported on Thursday on assessments released by the White House, the U.S. intelligence community, and the Pentagon, which conclude that climate change will exacerbate long-standing threats to global security. For Americans, this is far from a distant threat. A separate Washington Post analysis found that 1/3 of all Americans were directly affected by an extreme weather event over the summer months. Research by the journal Nature Climate Change found that at least 85% of the world's population has been affected by human-induced climate change. This is on top of the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, which warned in August of a code red for humanity. Let's hear first of all from Jeremy Mathis about these trends and what's at stake. Jeremy gives us both a practitioner perspective as a former U.S. government official working on Arctic issues and an academic point of view as a professor at Georgetown's Science, Technology, and International Affairs program, where he teaches on environmental security.
5 years ago, it was still very theoretical. It was still in the realm of science. We were talking about some general ideas about 1 degree Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius, and most people had no appreciation for what that meant. Today, I think far more people, not just in the United States, but around the world, understand what we mean when we say climate change. And we've also seen a big shift in the language that's coming out in the IPCC reports. A lot of the caveats are being dropped. A lot of the if this happens, then this might happen are being dropped. And the language is coming out and being much more explicit about this is going to happen. And the reason as scientists and as climate experts we can say that now is because they aren't based on projections anymore. They're based on the reality that we live in every single day. So the Washington Post did a really nice analysis of this a couple of weeks ago, and I hope a bunch of people in Washington read it, that showed that over the last 3 months, 1/3 of all Americans have been directly impacted by an extreme weather event, whether that was a hurricane, whether it was flooding, whether it was a heat wave or a wildfire. We're seeing real, tangible impacts of climate change now in our daily lives. And it's disrupting our ability to do commerce. It's disrupting our ability to do agriculture. It's disrupting our ability to live our lives the way that we have become accustomed to. And oh, by the way, we're dropping that on top of a global pandemic that has already disrupted our lives in huge and long-lasting ways. So for me, the thing that keeps me up at night now isn't just climate change. It's how these different drivers of disruption are coming together all simultaneously. We have a global pandemic on top of global climate change, on top of an already sort of destabilized geopolitical environment that we can only solve so many problems at one time. And I'm worried that the extreme events that we are now witnessing because of climate change are going to push us past some tipping points that are very difficult to overcome. You mentioned, Kelly, the class that I teach at Georgetown on environmental security. One of the things that always strikes me is how a lot of people don't understand sort of fundamentally how the environment works. And we draw most of our drinking water from aquifers that are deep down in the earth. We put a well down, and just like a straw, the well sucks that water up out of the aquifers and we drink it. We're drinking it at a very alarming rate, and we're not just drinking it, we're using to do agriculture in places that we should have never been doing that sort of agriculture to begin with. We borrowed against the future because we could use water in what we thought was unlimited quantities to grow crops that didn't belong in the places that we were trying to grow them in. And so because of that, we've exhausted or are on a pathway to exhausting a lot of our groundwater supplies. And a student in my class last week asked, well, why don't we just wait till those aquifers refill, right? It rains every day. Well, that's just going to refill the aquifer. And the answer is absolutely not. It takes thousands, 10,000s, hundreds of thousands of years to replenish those aquifers that we're drawing down, over a few years or a few decades. So in human timescales, we're not going to be able to repay this deficit that we've created in the environment because of our lack of long-term thinking. And just like our physical deficit, when we think about the federal government, we're building a very deep environmental deficit that we are going to have to deal with later on. But we keep saying later on when every time we turn on the news or every time we pick up a newspaper, later on was yesterday, right? And so for me, it's the lack of urgency we have in developing actual policies that are going to move us into a more sustainable environmental existence. And we can have the debate about fossil fuels and CO2 emissions, but that's only one part of it. And that gets very political very quickly. And that's the danger, is that while we're having endless debates about CO2 emissions, we're not really talking about our insecure water supply and how we're going to continue to provide water to millions of people, not just in the United States, but around the world in the coming decades.
We'll turn now to our main conversation on climate change and migration with Beth Ferris. Beth is a research professor in the Institute for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown and a non-resident senior fellow in foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. Her work covers many aspects of migration and forced displacement, including the impact of climate change on regular and irregular migration. Beth will walk us through the centrality of migration in the climate change debate, the need for clearer vocabulary to describe climate migrants and to explain climate migration more broadly, and the unfolding displacement crisis in Afghanistan and its potential global implications. Beth, I know you've participated in some of the ISD working groups that I run here. And we did have one, the first one actually, back in 2016, 2017, looked at environmental security and migration and how the two are so intertwined and what the situation in the world looked like at that time and how climate and environmental security was driving more migration. And I was wondering if you could sort of give us an update on that issue in the intervening, 4 or 5 years since we've done that working group. Where are we today with this confluence of environmental security, climate change, and migration?
Sure. I mean, I think the last 5 years there've been enormous recognition that climate change is driving migration, that it will continue to drive migration even more so in the future. We've had major reports have been issued, the World Bank's groundswell reports in 2018 and then again in September 2021 highlighted the fact that hundreds of millions of people will likely be moving internally within their countries by 2050. So there's much greater awareness of migration as one of the perhaps inevitable consequences of climate change. There are more studies, there are more conferences, there are more people working on the issue, all of which I think is a really good thing. Since the very first report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, way back in 1990, there's been a recognition that migration and increased migration due to climate change is going to be one of the major consequences and impacts of global warming on our planet. And we see governments just beginning to take it seriously. Not nearly seriously enough, I should say, but at least there's growing awareness of it. Also over the last 5 years, we've seen an amazing increase in the number of sudden onset disasters, whether wildfires in California or hurricanes or increased flooding that's displaced people. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Center estimates that about 25 million people are displaced every year by sudden onset disasters. I mean, last year there were 30 million people displaced by these disasters, most of which are climate related, and 80% of which occur in Asia, which is really the epicenter of a lot of the effects of climate change. We know from the research, from the scientific evidence, that sudden onset events, weather related events, are likely to increase in intensity and frequency and spatial duration as a result of climate change. And I think a lot of people are beginning to realize that this is going to be the new normal, living with heat waves and wildfires and preparing for ever stronger storm surges. And I think that's driving some of the increased awareness about the impact of climate change on migration. I might say that most displacement due to these sudden onset disasters is temporary. People evacuate when news of a hurricane occurs, and then they go home when the hurricane is past and clean up the mess that's left in their homes. But we're beginning to realize that sometimes this displacement isn't temporary, that sometimes people don't return. People from the Paradise wildfire in California in 2018 have yet to return and perhaps never will rebuild their homes and their original communities. So understanding these dynamics and preparing for them is absolutely essential as we go forward.
When we spoke to her a few weeks ago, Bibi Gonzalez, a food security and human rights organizer in Guatemala, also highlighted the issue of extreme weather events, such as hurricanes, in driving migration.
Late last year, 2020, there were 2 hurricanes in the period of 2 weeks that really devastated some parts of Guatemala and Central America, and even islands in Colombia. And this, when we talk about different climate conditions, here in that place, entire villages just disappeared. So there's a sense of course, they need to go and migrate somewhere, but this really also pushes migration towards other countries. Specifically, their production, their crops were lost. They didn't have food. The food response that they got was terrible, and it's just another example of how these events of climate, the effects of climate, have effects on people, what they eat, and then the decisions that they need to take in order to survive. And within that time, there is hunger, there is any type of insecurity. The road of migration is a feared one. There is a lot of abuses, exploitation, even trafficking comes there. So there are a lot of, yes, food is a human right, but when this is put into so much vulnerability, there are other consequences of other types of insecurity for human beings as well.
Kelly, this is one of the things that makes this issue so interesting, because it isn't just happening in the global south, it's happening in Germany, in the United States. I mean, here in the US, we have displacement, not just from wildfires, but from some of these slow onset sea level rise and global warming. And in Alaska, for example, there are 33 indigenous communities that have to move. They can no longer stay where they are because of melting permafrost and declining sea ice. And, it's really affecting communities throughout the United States. Louisiana is one of our states most affected by the long-term effects of climate change, with communities already relocating. This isn't something that's going to happen way in the future. It's happening now, and it's happening in the United States as well as in Bangladesh and Mozambique.
So one more question on this specific issue of climate and refugees before we move on. to another set of issues. One thing that came up a lot in our working group back 5 years ago was this issue of, how do we define people that move because of climate, and this issue of, we have refugees, and they're a distinct grouping of people that fall under a distinct definition, but talk about the difficulty with climate migrants and how we're trying to define them within the international community to try to give them some rights and things as they move.
And this is a major issue that we still haven't figured out what to call people who move, at least in part because of climate change. I mean, the fact is that most migration is multi-causal. People leave because of their economic situation, family relationships, personal tolerance of risk. I mean, I have two sisters who live in South Texas who were displaced 3 times last year by hurricanes and had flood damage to their homes. And one of my sisters said, "I've had it, I'm out of here," and moved to San Antonio. And the other sister in Galveston said, "I can't move. My husband's here, my job's here, my church is here. I can't move." So even the same environmental pressures will affect people in different ways. So it's very difficult to say someone is a climate migrant. I mean, is everybody leaving Honduras, for example, a climate migrant because there's drought there? I mean, certainly drought contributes to loss of livelihood, to food insecurity, which together with poverty and inequality and sometimes criminal violence is pressing people to move. But it's very hard to say someone is moving just because of climate change. Even with all these sudden onset disasters, we still can't say Hurricane Harvey was caused by climate change. We can say, overall the pattern is there are going to be more frequent severe storms, but we can't say any one storm is solely the result of climate change. So that makes it very difficult for policymakers trying to figure out how to deal with the reality that climate change is going to influence migration, but what to call people. We can't call them climate refugees. I mean, the refugee definition enshrined in the 1951 convention, widely accepted. There's no appetite for reopening that convention and defining that more broadly. And yet people who move because of disasters or climate change aren't really voluntary economic migrants either. They're not just searching for new jobs or opportunities. And so, our terminology hasn't caught up with the reality. Most of us refer to displacement or migration in the context of climate change, meaning climate change is playing a role, but not necessarily the only driver. Just this week, the Biden administration released its report on climate change and migration. This was asked for by President Biden way back in February, and the report just came out this week. And it's very clear that there's an acknowledgement by the U.S. government that this phenomenon is real. We have to do something about it. We have to change our policies. But embedded in the report, you also see the uncertainty with what to call these individuals. And how do you develop policies when it's hard to distinguish the target population, who you're talking about? So this is a big challenge. I think we're moving closer to some consensus of referring to people moving in the context of climate change or environmental migration rather than just climate change. I mean, we've always had hurricanes and droughts, long before human-induced climate change was real. And so, the terminology just hasn't caught up yet with the reality and the growing political awareness of this phenomenon.
Yeah, I think that's a bigger issue, I think, beyond just this problem set as well. We just did our latest working group was on food security. And again, we looked at it, and there's so many issues with the food system and the way the way we get food, the way we produce food, that one of the things we said was there just needs to be new vocabulary and a new way of thinking about this. And that's sort of the same issue that we dealt with in the working group on climate change and migration too. It's
Right.
as we adapt to actual climate change, we also have to adapt our thinking, and the way we talk about things and the terminology we use needs to change and move forward as well. And I think it's going to be an ongoing, difficult process, as you note. But moving on to another issue, migration issue, and one that I know you saw up close and personal a few weeks ago when you were out in Qatar teaching in our executive master's program out there. You went and visited some Afghan refugees that were in Doha at Al Udeid, and the impact of the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban and its impact on migration has been extremely large. As the issues fade from the headlines, what are some of the migratory consequences you've seen, and just what were your impressions with what you saw in Doha?
Yeah, I mean, the whole issue of refugees from Afghanistan has been a long-standing one. About 165,000 or so people evacuated in a few weeks from Afghanistan in late August, early September. That's really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of displacement and people being forced to move because of political changes and conflict inside Afghanistan. There are 4 million people who are displaced internally within the borders of Afghanistan. Many of them have desperate economic and humanitarian needs, trying to survive, to get enough food, medical care. The medical system is in shambles with civil servants not being paid, and the basic infrastructure required to service a large population is simply crumbling. So you've got internal displacement within Afghanistan. You've got 1.6 million refugees in Iran and Pakistan who've been there sometimes for decades, living in these very protracted refugee situations. And on top of that, you have this sudden evacuation of desperate people fleeing most recent developments in Afghanistan in August of this year. I saw some of these people in Doha a few weeks ago, and I was struck by how chaotic the evacuation still is. There's still flights arriving from Afghanistan into Doha. A lot of uncertainty about who's on these flights. Tremendous need for security vetting, people who arrive without any documentation, certainly before they move on to the U.S. And then there's some 20,000 Afghans who are waiting in other military bases outside of the United States for the chance to move to the United States, pending their vetting, security clearances, and just the practical details of how they will be received. For the U.S. government, it's a challenge on all sides in terms of those who are leaving, those who need to leave, people who are in the process of applying for SIV status, for example, or who worked with American forces or NGOs or aid programs who now feel threatened by the current situation. The Taliban has said they will allow people to leave on regular commercial flights if they have visas. Well, how do you get a visa right now when the embassies in Kabul are closed? Do you have to go to Pakistan in order to come to the United States eventually, even if you have a valid claim for persecution and meet other admissibility criteria? So there's a lot of uncertainty about continuing to help people escape the situation. And then there's some kind of ethical issues. Do people leaving right now have more of a claim on our resources than those who've been waiting in Peshawar refugee camps for years to try to have an opportunity to move on? How do you balance that? The UN has made it clear that its priority is going to be people still within Afghanistan. They're putting all their efforts to delivering aid to these 4 million internally displaced people and other people affected by the crisis. So, there are lots of competing priorities here. In the United States, on the receiving end, we have over 50,000 Afghans presently on 8 military bases around the U.S. The 9 refugee resettlement agencies scrambling, trying to figure out how to develop community support structures so they can leave the bases and start the process of resettling in the United States. Most of the Afghans in the U.S. are coming in under a program called humanitarian parole, where they don't automatically have the right to get a permanent residency in the U.S., a green card, if you will. They'll have to apply for asylum. Our asylum backlog is 1.6 million cases, years-long process requiring lawyers and complicated, long, lengthy, drawn-out process. We need some legislative action to simplify that for the Afghans. And then finally, I'll say, anytime there's a major new emergency, it takes all of the energy and resources away from existing crises. What's happening in Yemen and South Sudan and Venezuela, those crises haven't stopped because you've got an influx of Afghans leaving the country. But around the world, donor governments are saying, oh, we got to put more money into Afghanistan. Where will we find that money? Oh, let's cut the support for the World Food Program in Democratic Republic of Congo. So you see the knock-on consequences of what's happening in Afghanistan are many. I mean, it's a global phenomenon. It isn't just something affecting communities in the U.S.
So I think this demonstrates just how intertwined all of this is, and issues of climate change that are affecting food production and food supply chains, and then a mass climate event that happens that causes migration somewhere else is pulling funds away from the food programs and everything. And I think one thing that we've seen doing these working groups over the last few years is just how intertwined a lot of this is. And even in a place like the Arctic, where you have growing geopolitics, again, that's because of climate change and the fact that the Arctic's melting and that you can even get there now. You mentioned some other spots that are still reeling with migration issues, but what's kind of on your radar, if anything, on potential future hotspots that folks should be kind of on the lookout for irregular migration happening from somewhere?
Yeah, I think one of the current hotspots is Central America, and there too you see the intertwining of environmental, economic, political, criminal drivers of migration. But I think we need to spend a lot more time understanding why people are leaving and figuring out ways to enable people to remain where they are. I work a lot on internal displacement, people displaced within the borders of their country. And in places like El Salvador, people will move 5, 6, 10 times within the country before they're desperate enough to start that long and dangerous journey north. So I think that, really focusing on some of the issues around internal displacement in places like El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala would be a good thing to do when we're trying to understand these patterns of irregular migration. I think we're particularly worried about the situation in Venezuela. There seems to be no end to the crisis in sight, and we have, over 5 million Venezuelan refugees in neighboring countries. We don't hear as much about that because the governments in the region have, by and large, been quite generous in receiving Venezuelan migrants. But one thing we learn globally is that when people can't find safety or sustenance in the first country they go to, they move on. So Venezuelans who can't find their necessary support in Colombia might be on the road to someplace else after a certain amount of time. I'm worried about Yemen. That crisis has gone on. Syria has almost fallen off the radar screen. More indications that governments are accepting the reality of the Assad regime is continuing in the region. But what does that mean for the 6 million Syrian refugees living in neighboring countries? Will there be increased pressure for them to return? If there is increased pressure in Turkey or Jordan or Lebanon, it's likely that many of them will seek protection elsewhere, maybe making that long and dangerous journey to Europe, for example. So, I think there are a lot of hot spots and a lot of places where these situations have just lasted far too long. The Rohingya in Bangladesh, for example, that have been there since for the last 5 years with no future prospects. Bangladesh doesn't want them there. They can't go back to Myanmar unless the government does radical changes in their citizenship laws. There are no countries clamoring to resettle Rohingya refugees outside the region. They're just stuck in this limbo. And anytime you see these protracted, seemingly unresolvable refugee situations, it's a formula for future irregular migration. Desperate people do desperate things. If you've been sitting in a refugee camp and kids unable to go to school and you begin to think, there's got to be a better way, and there are also tons of criminal networks and smuggling organizations that are advertising widely in refugee camps around the world to promise hope for a better future. So I think that addressing some of these long-term protracted situations would do a lot to diminish the pressure on future irregular migration.
So we're getting close to COP26, which is coming up, and wanted to get you out of here with one last question on that, to see what are you expecting out of COP26 as far as migration is concerned?
I think most of the emphasis in COP26 is going to be on climate mitigation, on reducing those emissions that are causing global warming. This is probably the single thing that would have the biggest impact on future migration. So I think that's certainly to be lauded and appreciated. At the same time, I hope there's a realization that migration is not only a negative phenomena, that migration can be a very positive adaptation to climate change. People have always moved in response to environmental change, whether the Maya civilization or drought in Egypt, millennia ago, and not be afraid of migration, but plan for it and think about it. And, who in the community might leave or who might join our community from another area of particularly high climate risk. I think we all need to be thinking about this and planning for it and figuring out how to minimize the harmful effects of forced displacement, but to encourage people to move when they perceive that climate change is going to make their communities uninhabitable or less pleasant to live in, whether you're living in a coastal city in the United States or living in a drought-prone area in Central America. Migration may be a good answer for these situations, but recognizing the importance of migration as adaptation would be a tremendous accomplishment from COP26.
Thank you very much. This has been extremely informative, and we appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks, I've enjoyed it.
That was Diplomatic Immunity. Thanks for listening. Please rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever they listen to podcasts. Thank you to Emily Lynn for her assistance with this episode, and to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast and for ISD's research on the new global commons. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy, and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. Until we meet again.